Feels weird. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Provo Municipal Council meeting for Tuesday, July 23rd, 2019. It is 5:34 p.m. and we are in the City Center Municipal Council chambers at 351 West Center Street, Provo, Utah. This meeting is being broadcast live on the web on the Provo City Council YouTube channel, where it'll also be available for on-demand viewing. The council requests that attendees help maintain the decorum of the meeting by silencing electronic devices, being respectful to others, and refraining from applause or other outbursts during the proceedings of the meeting. We will begin with the roll call. Mr. Parker.
Wayne Parker.
Mayor Kafusi.
George Handley.
Dave Connect.
Kay Van Buren.
David Harding.
Dave Sewell.
Gary Winterton.
Cliff Strachan.
Brian Jones.
Thank you. Our opening prayer will be given by Mr. Caleb Dewey of the Provo City Youth Council, and followed by the Pledge of Allegiance provided by Mr. David Rogers, the council intern.
Dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful for this opportunity we have to come together and learn and solve problems and progress. We ask that we may be able to get much done and appreciate this organization we have in this city we have. We're grateful for the many people in our city that are very willing to serve and help. We ask blessings upon them, that they may be guided and know what to do, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Dewey and Mr. Rogers. We will now consider the approval of the council meeting minutes for April 9th, June 4th, and June 18th, 2019. Are there any requested changes or objection to approval? Seeing none, I declare the minutes approved by unanimous consent. So, as indicated, or as will be indicated on the screen, a required public hearing will be held for certain agenda items prior to council action. After each such item has been presented, time to comment will be provided for all those who wish to speak. For items that do not require a public hearing, public comment will still be taken following presentation of the item, but will be limited to 10 minutes. At this time, 15 minutes have been set aside for an open public comment period, which is intended to allow comment on matters that do not appear on the agenda. Persons who speak during this time to an item that is on the agenda will not normally be afforded a second opportunity to speak during the comment period specific to that item. During the public comment period, each speaker will generally be limited to 2 minutes. Additional time may be given to individuals specifically invited to speak, such as applicants, neighborhood chairs, or others who may be representing additional persons. At this time, we'll do the public comment, and please begin your comments by stating your name and city of residence. Due to noticing requirements, no formal action will be taken in this meeting on matters that do not appear on the agenda. So anyone who has comments, please come forward now.
Hi, good evening, Mayor Kafusi and council members. My name is Kay Nelson. I live in Provo in Edgemont, and I've been here several times now talking about a big high-density, high-impact housing development plan for the green foothills of Northeast Provo. In the time since developer Bob Jones held a meeting at the end of May proposing the Terra development, our group of neighbors has done a lot of research. We've talked to city employees in zoning and planning and with many of you. We even met with Mr. Jones and others a few weeks ago to hear more about his plan. This group of neighbors I'm a part of is for proactive development. We are for development, not against it. Proactive is a term coined by our very own Provo neighbor, Stephen Covey. Proactive means to take action based on deeply held values. Those deeply held values are responsible, sustainable development that create neighborhoods we can be proud of 5 generations from now. We are aware of an item on your work agenda earlier this afternoon identifying ways to protect the foothills. We hope you make progress on coming up with a stronger code for a sensitive lands ordinance and fully enforce it anytime someone wants to develop on our precious green space. Nearly 1,900 people have signed the first petition against the Terra development, and many will be on board to sign a new petition once we refine our focus throughout Provo. We want to work with you to see that development is zoned properly like the existing R110. This isn't just an issue for the Edgemont area. We're concerned about proactive developments across Provo, and our desire is that the planning and zoning commissions, as well as each of you, will adhere to a standard that will not decimate the green spaces and natural areas and foothills of Provo. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson.
Hi, my name is Tamala Blake. I live in Provo. I as well agree with what Kay, I'm here for the same reason as Kay Nelson. I want to protect the green space and the natural areas of Provo. The high density and medium density developers need to have incentives to use areas that already have the infrastructure in place and where transportation like UVX exists already. In recent meetings, it has been discussed that the hills up to Squaw Peak Overlook and all the way from the Indian Road Trailhead up to Bridalveil Falls may someday be developed. This was shocking, and I hope that we can make a stand to make a better plan for our city. Why on earth would we destroy the beauty of our hills and mountains when medium and high density can go somewhere where infrastructure already exists? We are blessed to live right here near these majestic mountains in this beautiful city of Provo. We need to be smart now as we plan for the future to keep what is precious to so many of us and will be precious to our great-grandchildren. Just because something can be built doesn't mean it should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Blake.
I'm Kissy Watkins, and I live in the North Edgemont part of Provo. I'm with these guys. We looked up some of the codes that you already have in the Provo City Code's general plan. And there are some wonderful things about this already there. Code 1.4.3.6 says, encourage maximum build-out in existing higher density areas south of Brigham Young University and within the central business district with adequate parking and infrastructure. 1.4.6.3, improve the access and recreational uses to the Wasatch Mountains east of Provo and especially Provo, Slate, and Rock Canyons. 1.4.6.4, include preservation of vistas and views in open space requirements. This means, according to how we read this, that we should be able to continue to look at the beauty of the hills and mountains and not just build up on them so that we can see down into the valley. We need to preserve the view for everyone. 1.4.9.2, ensure adequate enforcement of zoning regulations. We believe that if the northeast area of Provo is annexed into Provo, it should come in at R110 zoning, not at high or medium density. We're asking for something that we are sure you already want, and that is to be wise in your planning and hold to codes established to preserve Provo's beauty and appeal for our time and for all future generations. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Watkins, sorry. Are there any other public comment? Seeing none, I'll close the public comment portion of the meeting, and we will move on to agenda item number 1, which is a resolution consenting to the appointment of individuals to the Transportation and Mobility Advisory Committee. This will be presented by our Mayor, Michelle Kafusi.
Thanks, Chairman Harding and council members. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm here to present a resolution consenting to the appointment of individuals to the Transportation and Mobility Advisory Committee. Their names are Jim Hamula and Stephen Mongi, and just here to ask if you have any questions about that. These are, I believe, our last two before all our boards and commissions will be completed.
Do we know if Mr. Is it Mongi?
Mongi.
If he's here?
I didn't see him. Did you see him, Gary?
I didn't see Steve here tonight. I'd be glad to tell you, I know Steve quite well. He is from South Africa, and he's had a lot of experience in larger cities and understands traffic issues, calming issues, mobility issues, and he's very concerned about biking and walkability in our community. He lives just east of Canyon Road on 2200 North towards the LDS Temple on that area, and very smart man, open, and I have all the respect in the world for Steve Mongi.
Thank you, Mr. Winterton. Just out of a personal curiosity, do we know which board members these two are replacing?
I believe Ryan Franson
Okay.
is one of those they'll be replacing, and I'm not sure the other one, their term was up and decided to move on.
Okay, great. Any other questions from the council?
Mr. Chair, Hannah, if you could scroll up to the exhibit, it'll show you who all of the 7 are. So if you knew the names of the previous ones, you'd be able to determine who's being replaced.
Thank you for that, Mr. Jones. Thank you, Mayor. And we will now open this item for public comment. If anyone is here and would like to speak, you may come forward now. Okay, seeing none, we'll close the public comment. Is there any discussion among council members? Seeing none, I'll call for a vote on the implied motion. All those in favor? It's unanimous with Councillor Stewart excused. Action agenda item number 2 is an ordinance to amend Provo City Code regarding design standards in various high-density residential and campus mixed-use zones. This does have citywide impact and will be presented by Mr. Bill Pepperoni, Assistant Director of Community Development.
As we discussed a little bit on pre-meeting, the staff is bringing forth these additional edits to this, the design requirements for the zones you referred to kind of tighten up some loopholes that we have found in the existing ordinance. Mr. Cabanella and I did just spend an hour meeting. I think part of his concerns were assuaged by understanding that the buildings that we referred to with doors on the street, that's not the only door to the unit. In fact, it's the back door. In some cases, like at the Liberty Center, where they use those doors regularly, I'm sure there'll be other projects, perhaps like at 200 City View, where they won't be used that often, but the idea was to still have the doors on the street. He had another concern regarding location of parking, but we weren't able to find in the amendment where that concern was. So he and I will continue to meet in the coming weeks. We're also willing to meet with any other developers the City Council would like us to meet with in the interim. But the general bottom line of this of these amendments kind of boil down to giving the Planning Commission some discretion that they don't have now in having some flexibility in how people meet these requirements. That addition to the amendments was at the request of the Design Review Committee, who did review the proposed amendment. The most substantial changes are the table that you have within the text that refers to how many doors you need to have on the street, how frequently you need to have doors on the street. It's substantially more for commercial than for residential. Habitable floor area is now a requirement in these zones, where it's now only a requirement in the downtown zones and the ITOD zone. And then the building materials has been bolstered. We've had projects where, because of the way the building materials are currently written, after a project was approved and was under construction, the developers came back and kind of switched out some of the things that we thought we were going to get, and the way the code was written right now, it allowed them to do that. This gives us a little bit more ability to keep them to what they showed the Planning Commission and what they showed the City Council as they went through their approval process. That's all I have.
Any questions or comments for Mr. Pepperoni? I'd just like to thank you for meeting with Mr. Cabanella and for your openness to engage with the developers in our community. We've had past conversations about form-based code and you know, how best to approach this, and I think this is a good, perhaps small step, but a solid step forward towards that, and I'm very supportive of this, and hope that we can use these type of regulations in the future as well as we go forward. So, thank you.
Thank you. You've heard me say before that zoning ordinances are very good at telling the development community what we don't want to have happen, but they're not descriptive at all in saying what we do want to take place, which is what you're referring to. This ordinance really does help people understand up front, you know, what the city's looking for before, hopefully before they ever start the approval process.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. We'll open this up to the public for comment. If anyone is here to speak to this, please come forward now. Seeing none, we will close the public comment. This is the first hearing for this item. It is a land use item, so per council rules, if there's any member of the council who would like to consider this item again at the second hearing, you may indicate now, and it will be continued for until the next meeting. Mr. Connect, thank you for that. Otherwise, I would have raised my hand. So this item is continued, and we will hear it for a second time at the, when would that be? July,
June, August 6th.
August 6th meeting. Thank you. Appreciate the backup and support. Any discussion on this before we move to the next item? Yes.
I'm going to be out of town on that date, so I might as well just say I'm supportive of this. I think it's well considered, and I like what it is aimed at accomplishing, and I think we need it. So I'm hopeful that we'll pass it when the time comes.
Thank you, Mr. Handley.
Questions on the reason for the carry forward? Are we looking for assignments? What questions are there assignments that have been? I think we did discuss some in the work session. And where are we going with this from here?
I have some thoughts, but okay. Well, for me, I think when we changed our approach for land use items, we sped the process up. That as a counter to that, the idea was the default would be that we would hear things twice, and it gives the community a greater chance to be aware of the items that we're considering. Now we've realized that there would be some items that were so routine, so non-controversial, that it was pointless to have a second hearing. So we do have the ability to pass things on the first hearing. But in my opinion, this is a big enough item that even though I fully support it, I do want to make sure that the members of our community who will be directly affected by this, most directly probably our developers, that they have the full opportunity to be aware of it, to provide input, as Mr. Cabanella did earlier, and to have their questions asked and answered, hopefully before it becomes the law. So that's why I support the continuation for 2 more weeks.
We discussed, Bill, can you help me out here? We discussed some, Mr. Cabanella pointed out some safety concerns that he might have had. You've addressed them, and if I have further questions, that was one of the reasons that would I come to talk to you, to community development? Point me in the right direction.
Yes, please come visit with me. Mr. Cabanella's concern was that he would feel less safe having a daughter rent a unit that had a door on the street. I'm not sure that idea or opinion changes, whether it's a back door or a front door. It's just that extra entry point that somebody could take advantage of was a concern to him. But I'm happy to visit with you about any other provisions you'd like to discuss.
I'm curious a little bit about some other areas, so I will visit with you. Thank you.
I think he raises a good point. For example, Liberty Center across the street is a very secure building. You have to have a key fob to get in from any direction. But if you go directly through somebody's door, that's not quite as secure, or may not be quite as secure.
Thank you. I'll get with you.
Any more discussion? Okay. We move on to item 3, an ordinance amending Provo City Code, Chapter 9.80, to update language and amend procedures regarding permit parking areas. And I should have mentioned this earlier in the meeting. This item was continued during our work meeting, and the proposal has been sent back to a council committee for further work. So we will be not hearing that in our evening meeting right now. Before we move on to item number 4, I would like to welcome the members of our Provo Youth City Council who are with us tonight, and Ms. Patterson. I think I got that right. I apologize. I know you well, but drawing a blank. It's nothing. What's that? Okay. Anyway, we'd like to welcome you and thank you for being engaged and involved in the community. So thank you and welcome. Item number 4 is a resolution authorizing the mayor to sign a water carriage agreement with Central Utah Water and the U.S. Department of the Interior. This will be presented by Mr. Calder, our Division Director for Water Resources. Thank you.
Council, what we have in front of you is an agreement. It's a 40-year agreement that the city will enter in. It basically replaces a prior agreement that expired in 2015 as a result of it being expired because of the fact that Utah Power and Light sold their power right up the Olmsted diversion up to Provo Canyon to Central Utah. So we have a new owner that we are working with. But this agreement allows Provo City to use, in agreement with with Central Utah Water and the Department of Interior, the pipes that are in the canyon, where we pay a percentage. It's called a carriage agreement for the water that is carried through those pipes. The total amount, for example, for the last several years has been a total of $25,000. But it's a small agreement, but it has a 40-year lifetime to it before we renegotiate. It's a needed asset for the city that we make sure that we continue this agreement with Central Utah Water, who we work with on our water out of Provo River, as well as Deer Creek Reservoir. So.
Thank you, Mr. Calder. Any questions or comments? Thank you. Now we will open this for public comment. Is there anyone here to speak to this? Seeing none, we will close the public comment and bring it to the council for discussion. Is there any discussion on this item? Seeing none, I will call for a vote on the implied motion. All in favor? It's unanimous with Councilor Stewart excused. If there is no objection, we will now recess as the Municipal Council of Provo and reconvene as the Redevelopment Agency of Provo by unanimous consent. Mr. Chair.
Okay, next item, number 5, a resolution authorizing the Chief Executive Officer to enter into an owner participation agreement with Millrace Development, LLC, to transfer agency-owned property for a project located between 5th South and 6th South and 100 West and University Avenue. And this will be presented by David Walter.
Chair Connect, agency board members, good evening. If I could ask for your indulgence, the developer is kind of tied up in traffic and is on here, but the item that's the following item, that developer is here. So if you have no objections, I would request that we go a little out of order.
Okay. Let me read that in and then we'll get started. Item 6, a resolution approving a lease agreement with Blue Sky Development to allow them to utilize parking spaces for a pending mixed-use project at 105 East Center Street. And again, this will be presented by David Walter, our redevelopment director.
Agency board members, good evening. This item is for the use of some agency-owned spaces within the Wells Fargo parking structure. So we've had some conversations not only with the now current owner, which is Norco Vista, located in Rancho Cucamonga, California, about the mix of spaces and the use and their willingness to allow this to happen. And you will remember that we had some robust conversations last time about the number of spaces and allocating and dedicating. And so I know that Mr. Christensen's had the opportunity to speak with some of you. And I've had the opportunity to speak with Mr. Christensen, and what we are going to propose is that in order to meet the requirements under the code of 57 spaces, that we would dedicate 37 stalls and allocate 20. And with the provision that if he's successful with the 2 restaurants, that he can come back and request the remaining stalls to be dedicated. The owner of the parking structure has got no issue with that. He has just requested that they be made an additional insured on any insurance that Mr. Christensen would provide through the agreement, and Mr. Christensen has agreed to do that. Out of that 37 spaces that they're dedicating, he is requesting that we would have 12 for the executive suites that would be along 100 East. And then that would be the remaining 25 that would be for the restaurant uses that are proposed on the first floor, ground level of the restaurant. So we would envision that those would be restricted from Monday through Thursday from 8 to 10, and then on the weekends, they would be from 8 to 12 or 1 whenever they close. So that they would be available for use by the public at other times in that process. This is in recognition of, the fact that Mr. Christensen is putting in a significant amount of money into that end of Center Street. So it really is the end of the commercial type development on Center Street. This would be the end of that, the kind of the capstone of that project. He is working to attract retailers or restaurateurs rather that would come into this new project. So he's got a bit more significant capital cost in there. And so in order to help his restaurateurs be successful and succeed, he's requesting the 25 dedicated spaces. And then the 12 spaces that would be for the office users, those would be for example, if you have a CPA who leases the space and during the tax season, there would be occasions that he would need to spend the night at his office, that he would have a secure, the CPA would then have a secure place to park their vehicle and access it. He has also requested that we would increase the lease amount, so it would be $10 per space, and that would be for 10 years, and then for the next 10 years, we would go to $30, and then after that, after the next 10-year period for the remaining 26, he would go up to $50 per space. He would request also that he would like to have those same terms apply to the 20 spaces that are allocated and that could be dedicated later on. And then he would ask that the council consider allowing him to come back and revisit that if his restaurateurs are struggling and they need some additional space, that we could then come back and talk about that negotiations then. So this is something I think that the agency can support. We think it's a worthwhile investment, and it brings some additional opportunities to that end of the Center Street and helps continue the efforts that have already been done on Center and University. I am available for any additional questions, and Mr. Christensen is here as well.
So how does this, what does this leave in reserve for the other projects that we anticipate on the block?
So this would leave, if we do the 37, this would leave us approximately 35 to 40 spaces out of our 204.
And that includes the 80 that were allocated for the northeast corner. Has anything been allocated for the southwest corner project that might come back in the near future?
No. So are you referring to the University Tower project? So we had previously terminated that agreement because the funding mechanism that they required, that they were relying on, was the Central Business District project area, and that area ended. And so we sent the developers a notice that they were going to have to do that. We didn't have a funding source at that time, and so we have not entered into a new I know that they've had discussions about that possibility, but I don't know that they've reached out to the owners of the Wells Fargo structure, because they were talking about some sort of access within the structure itself, and that would not be within our purview or control.
So do we know how many spaces they were looking at needing?
I don't know. I know that they had planned to have about 5 levels of parking in their structure that would wrap around the Knight building. And they would still need to have the agency's property that's along University in the back. But there were some property transfers that needed to occur outside of our control, and I don't believe that's happened yet either. So
So in theory, they may not need any spaces in the Wells Fargo?
In theory,
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we had some idea of the other projects that will be built on the block, and if we can meet all of their needs.
at the present, I would say yes, but I'm not sure, given the number of spaces that they would need and the access that they would have through the structure, and what that would do to the existing spaces in the structure. So for example, I know that the one project that's being discussed for the 80 East portion, they also would require a modification to the parking structure, and that's not within our ability to grant or to consider.
Okay, any other questions from the council before we ask probably the applicant to come up? Okay, thank you. McKay?
Evening. Hi. There are a couple things maybe that I would just add to that, and then you guys are, be free to ask me any questions that you have. But so, and I sent this spreadsheet over to Cliff, and I apologize that I don't have it today, but I went through and ran calculations on the amount of revenue, and I talked about, I mentioned this with some of the council members that I met with yesterday, but calculated the revenue that would be generated off of the property tax and the retail tax, and it amounts to about $75,000 a year in revenue, plus by raising what it is that we propose now to pay per stall to basically lease the 37 stalls. It's another probably $6,000 or so. So it's a little over $80,000 a year, which over a 10-year period is just shy of $1 million. So we're generating about $80,000 a year for the city and about $1 million, which for 37 stalls, I know I had it, it's about $110 per stall. So if you look at like 63, for example, they pay $30 per stall, and we're paying, I guess, the equivalent of about $110 per stall. So by virtue of the property tax, the income tax, and the actual rent that we're paying, it amounts to about $110 per stall. Trying to think of anything else to add there. The idea behind separating them out, basically, as Dave mentioned, is you'd have 12 stalls that would be basically an overnight stall. We were previously asking for 57 stalls that we could just have purely dedicated overnight all the time. We've separated it out, so we have 12 stalls that are dedicated all of the time, and then 25 stalls that are just during the hours of operation for the retail. Basically 10 a.m. or about 8 a.m. till 10 a.m. whenever they close. On the weekends, it would obviously be a little bit longer. But the intent there is, of course, that we just want them for the retail, and that's it. We just want to make sure that the retail can survive and thrive. Trying to think of any other points, maybe. That's all I got offhand, unless you have any questions.
I appreciate your presentation. I would just point out that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's good to have something new come in. We're kind of excited to have that redeveloped. That's great. There are other businesses, some of which have been there for many years, that pay sales tax and property tax and don't really have any parking privileges, and frankly, most of the money that comes in with property and sales tax goes to pay for the police and fire and all the services that we provide for the city. And so I just feel that all the money that you're bringing in doesn't necessarily go to offset the parking, because we do have other things that we have to supply.
Yeah, and I mean, what I've calculated is the amount of money that would be collected by the city. How that gets allocated within the city, I don't know. I would say, I think what I would say to that is that the parking is owned by the redevelopment agency, and we've talked about this before. It's not owned by the city; it's owned by the RDA for the express purpose of redeveloping downtown. Right? That's why the RDA owns it. It's to encourage new growth and new development, not. That most of what's down there are 100-year-old buildings that have been there for 100 years. And the RDA's purpose is to promote new growth and new development, and therefore they give incentives, to the people or front runners that are coming on in and doing those things. And that's what I always understood the purpose of that parking to be for. So when you do generate new tax and new income, it's going towards paying off the investment that the city made in building the parking. And of course, our building, it's a lot more expensive than a lot of the buildings that are, all of the buildings that are 100 years old. We can't afford to survive off $20 in rent, which is, mostly what people are getting down there. And anyway, it's just more difficult to lease up, more expensive to lease up.
So in your building, you apparently will have sufficient for the residents.
That's right.
In parking. And there's not a perfect match between the residents, at least, and restaurants. If it was some other business, maybe you could have a perfectly shared parking. Mm-hmm. And what you do with your parking is certainly up to you, but there may be a possibility that you could have some of your parking structure available for maybe the lunchtime crowd or some other space during the daytime. I don't know.
Yeah, we can't do that. And primarily because, and I understand what you're saying, what you're saying is correct, is that, like, for example, if you have, if we were doing a mixed-use development, say, for example, like what they're doing on Freedom, like what PEG is doing, right? They got parking bonuses and other bonuses because what you have is you've got office space and you have residents that are all living together. Now, you can't take the residential stalls and actually allow them to be used for anything other than residential, but you can bring down the total parking requirements because people aren't using cars to go back and forth. They're just working where they live. And so the amount of parking that may be needed, for example, for the office can come down because you're getting those economies of scale. But in residential, you cannot, in my experience, ever say, that stall is, because what happens if somebody's sick? What happens when they come home? It's just a residential stall is a residential stall. So within our building, those are designated, and we can't open them up to retailers. If someone came home and it was taken, they would, they'd have nowhere to go. So
right, so they're actually numbered, so you have your own personal spot.
Yep, everyone has their own designated stall. That's right.
So it's not just you have this and you can park anywhere.
Yeah, room 115 has stall 115.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, unless there's any questions from council members, maybe we can open up to the public.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, do you mind if I add one other thing?
Sure.
I would say with regards to the Wells Fargo parking structure, I know that 63 has their stalls that are allocated for the residential. 80 East, they have an amendment to that lease agreement that gives them an additional 60 stalls that gets added to the 80 East. It was added to the 80 East lot. That was the intent. But what it says as a part of that lease agreement is that notwithstanding the foregoing, the option shall only be exercisable if the landlord has additional parking stalls that are not being leased by other tenants at the time tenant exercises the option, which means if the city has stalls that are designated or allocated or whatever, then 80 East gets no stalls. And so to say that they're absolutely designated to 80 East is not true. There's a provision in there that makes an exception for that. And then, of course, there's 500 stalls within the Wells Fargo parking structure, not just the 204. And so I think that the additional logic is when the office is gone, to your point, in the evenings, you still have some additional stalls that are out there. So anyway.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone from the public that would like to address this issue? Seeing no one come forward, bring it back to the council for any discussion. actually to the board. Gary, anything?
I appreciate what McKay just did. He lowered his the amount that he needs and that he's asking for, and raised the price, and I appreciate that. I am just I'm still a little unsettled. I personally feel like I need just a little bit more time to understand the ramifications of what we've got and what potentially we need to do. I'm not adverse at this point at giving him to him, but I'm just unsettled on what we have left, and I'd like to get a little bit more clarification in my own mind around that.
Okay. Other comments? Dave Sewell?
Just a clarification. So I was just looking at the agreement in the agenda packet. Is this the latest agreement? Because it mentions 55 stalls here, and I didn't see it.
So we had talked about this compromise previously, but the exact numbers we just worked out this afternoon. And so we've not had the chance to update the agreement that would be available. So we were asking for approval of the concept, and we would modify the agreement for.
Are the options, are they the developers? Are they developers' options, or are they city options as we move down the road?
We had talked about, so the developer would have the option to come back and talk to us, but we had talked about the agency, as this moves forward, having that consideration as well, right?
I just wanted to say I'm supportive of staff's recommendation on this, and I think it'll be a good project and a real benefit to that end of Center Street.
Okay.
Mr. Waller, what is our responsibility on the maintenance of the Wells Fargo parking structure? As a city, what's our, is there a financial cost that?
No, we do not have a cost for the maintenance of the Wells Fargo.
So all the maintenance of that structure is private somewhere else? Okay.
Right, I think we're asking Mr. Christensen if there's any damage to the stalls that we dedicate for him, that he would do that. But in terms of our responsibility to Norco Vista LLC, I don't believe that we have one.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I also am supportive of this. I think, I think there are larger questions that need to be addressed by our recently formed, did we form a committee or approve of the formation of a committee today to look at broader parking issues downtown? But I think this is a good compromise. I don't think we're as locked in as we felt we might be, and yet I think this also gives Mr. Christensen, the flexibility he needs to be able to get the retailers, restaurants in that we all want. I think this is a really exciting project. I think it's an unusually exciting project, actually, in a very important location. I think it fits the needs for which those stalls were designed to help us with. And I recognize that there's some sticky issues here, but with other businesses and other needs. But I think we've got sort of a middle ground here with enough flexibility that allows for us to serve and meet the needs of other current and future opportunities. So McKay didn't say a whole lot about it in his comments just now, but I think it's been a very long haul. I think he's put a lot of investment into this with the expectation that we would do something like this. So I think I'm just eager to facilitate this to move forward, especially after this compromise.
Yes, Dave.
Just so I make sure I understand correctly, the 25 dedicated stalls that are being requested, they would be dedicated from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. on weeknights, and
8 a.m.
8 a.m.
to 10 p.m. Monday through Thursday.
10 p.m.
And then Friday and Saturday.
8 a.m. to
And
midnight.
supposing the restaurant's open on Sunday, I mean, I can't, at this point, I don't know that they would be, I don't know that they wouldn't be, but we would anticipate that the restaurants would stay, for at least Friday and Saturday, that the restaurants would be open later.
Okay.
So they'd probably be from 8 to 12 or 8 to 1.
And what's the value of having them not dedicated or, open to the public from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m.? And I thought that the point was made that, you don't share residential stalls, so these can't be used for residential. These would only be used for retail,
So
business.
there's going to be a lot of prep work that they'd have to do to be able to open in time for an 11 o'clock lunch crowd. So this gives them time to get there and get some of the staff to park there and get ready and open, ready to serve at 11 o'clock.
Okay. My question was actually the reverse of that, so I'll try to be a little bit clearer. So when I first heard 8 to 10 and 8 to 12, I thought those were PMs, and so that would make those stalls available to, say, office workers during the workday, and then they become dedicated in the evening. If they're dedicated from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., I guess I don't see much value in not having it that way versus 24/7, because they're only not dedicated from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. when I don't think there's going to be really demand for parking. And as was pointed out, you wouldn't use those for residents.
No.
Who are pretty much the only
Overnight
users of overnight parking. So I don't feel like moving from 37 dedicated all the time to 12 dedicated all the time, and these 25 dedicated from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. I don't see much difference
Comment.
in that.
So if you're living in like 63 East and you have certain stalls already designated for you as a resident, but you want to have a party, you want to have something with a lot of people over, it could spill over and be to some advantage in the later hours. Somebody spending the night, whatever.
After 8 p.m. on a weeknight. So, okay. The other comment that was made, there's 500 stalls here, and when the office closes, they can be used for the public. And I think that's a perfect example of how parking stalls, if they're kept flexible, can be much more effectively used, much more efficiently used. We get much more value when they're open and can be used by whoever needs them at the time. There's 500 stalls. We have many that are not allocated or dedicated to anyone currently, the RDA, which we are the board of. And yet, I heard this past weekend when there was an event at both the, was it at the, I can't remember. There were two events. One was at the convention center, and then there was another event going on as well. And pretty much all stalls were filled, and that's with a lot of the stalls that we control not allocated. And so even though they're not allocated, and even though that 80 East project, they're not being used now, they are being used by the public. And so any stalls that we dedicate we are taking out of the public use. And I would say that right now, these that are controlled by the redevelopment agency are being used by the public for the public benefit, for economic activity. And the more that we pull out of that, particularly if we dedicate them so they can't be used generally, I feel is a bad idea, particularly if we're talking about, you know, a decades-long agreement. And while these are dedicated, these will be dedicated for these restaurants, and no one else can use these parking stalls, there's no reason to believe that patrons of these restaurants will only use these dedicated stalls. They will use the on-street spaces if they're available. They will, you know, they'll pull into whatever is the first stall that's available. And so I'm concerned if this agreement was for a shorter period of time, I'd be much more open to this. But particularly as we're looking to address our long-term parking needs and ensure efficient use of the parking resources that we have now to benefit all of our downtown users, I don't feel comfortable with dedicating these that are being requested.
One thing about the conventions, I took a tour of the facility with a person who's lived and worked in the downtown area for many years, and he says he's never seen the very first floor of the facility, the roof, filled. He's confident no one's ever parked there, period. Even during conventions and other kinds of things, it's never filled up. I mean, I think the concern I have is if we're saying no to this after I think a pretty reasonable compromise has been made for a reasonably small number of stalls, for precisely the kind of project we want downtown, because we have a vague and undefined use of those spots, that's on us. I mean, I think we've got a situation now where we've had a project that was designed with some expectations. I mean, in my conversations with McKay and in our other city conversations, we've gone back and forth on this question of allocated versus dedicated and what was the understanding and so on and so forth. And I think we're at a point now where we've got to make a compromise to be reasonable. Otherwise, we're putting the developer in a situation where we've been sort of creating the impression that this was the kind of arrangement that we could drop, and then if we're just going to say zero dedicated, I think that's unfair. So I really think I don't think the risks are nearly as high as you're describing, Dave, and I do think that the advantages of being willing to make a compromise here are far outweighing the risks of that we're sort of vaguely describing here, because I don't even feel like we've defined what those risks are exactly. And until we have the parking committee working on this, it's a comprehensive issue anyway. It's not just about this one facility; it's about lots of other facilities. So I'm willing to say this project means enough to the city and to that downtown area that this is the kind of investment we're willing to make. And I think, like I say, we've already cut back significantly from where we were, so that's why I think we'd be making a mistake if we didn't support this.
Dave?
So I'd kind of like to separate this into two questions. The first question would be, if Mr. Christensen were to walk in the door today and we were beginning a negotiation today on this project, what would we want to do with parking? What would we be willing to offer in return for this project that we all say we want, I think? And we might each come to a different conclusion about what where the trade-off would be in terms of how much parking we would offer in order to get this great project. But I really think there's a separate question here, and I appreciated the eloquent way that you explained it, Mr. Hanley, in that Mr. Christensen came to us several years ago, and it's pretty clear to me that he has very consistently asked for dedicated spaces throughout this whole time, and he's provided agreement drafts that were written that way, and we didn't ask for changes. So maybe there have been some misinterpretations or misunderstandings or whatever, but we have clearly allowed this to go forward for several years with him believing that we're working toward a situation where he would have dedicated spaces. And like you said, I'm really concerned if we were to pull out of that at this point, and I'd like to compare that to a personal experience that I just had in the last week and a half. My company was negotiating with another company concerning an agreement that involved a lot of money for me and for my company. We had numerous conversations about what the agreement would be. We had email exchanges, and it was pretty clear what the expected outcome was. And then at the last minute, just a week and a half ago, the company informed me that there was another player involved that had a different idea, and so they weren't going to be able to proceed as we had been talking for the last 8 months. And it was a significant financial disadvantage to me. And anyway, I can just tell you that leaves a really sour taste in a person or a company's mouth, so to speak, to invest and get that far along. And I think this situation has been actually going on much longer. So I'm concerned about the message that we would be sending to developers, and I'd like to stand behind our RDA committee and our RDA employees and the negotiations that they've been conducting for the last several years. And I agree this seems like a reasonable compromise to get him at least enough to proceed in the way that we had hoped that he would, and without sort of pulling the rug out and moving the goalposts.
Okay, yes, Dave.
So we've heard from our RDA director. I've also had conversations with other city employees over the past few weeks, including our parking coordinator, who is not here tonight. I didn't know if the mayor or if Mr. Parker were interested. We've heard from one director. Any thoughts on whether this is kind of a unanimous opinion of the city staff, or any thoughts that the rest of the administration may have?
Let me just make one observation, and if you'd like to hear from Austin, you certainly can. As I tried to characterize in the earlier meeting today, when we began the process of subsidizing parking structures in the downtown, and we've done that with four different developments in the last 25 years or so, our interest in doing so was to stimulate development in the downtown that the city wanted to see. And so we began the process of looking at Yeah, again, downtown at the time had been through a pretty substantial decline, lots of empty storefronts. The economics of downtown were really struggling. And again, all of this was before the Marriott, which started out as the Excelsior, the Wells Fargo building, the expansion of New Skin, Zions Bank, the convention center, a lot of the things that have happened that have led to us having some specific parking challenges in the downtown. At no point did we think that any of these parking structures and the spaces that might have been reserved by the city or the redevelopment agency would ever begin to meet the parking needs of downtown. They were really designed in a way to say, if we do this, developers of the Wells Fargo building, will you come build a multi-story office building for us? And consequently, all of these other developments. Had we had a really perfect crystal ball and could say exactly what downtown was going to look like in 2019, we might have defined those parking agreements much differently. We might have specified allocated versus reserved. We might have laid out some very specific standards had we known all that at the time. The fact was we didn't, and when the city got into those agreements, they were much more about trying to figure out a way to close a financial gap than they were about thinking about parking capacity. And it really wasn't until we began looking at the strategic parking plan, which we discussed again in some detail earlier today, that we really started thinking about how do these parking structures and the available stalls contribute to meeting the needs for public parking in the downtown. And so we do need to take a much more comprehensive look. And I think in a perfect world, had we known that, or had we been dealing with these questions today of how would we structure those parking agreements, we might have been a lot more defined, and we might have raised some more specific issues that will more clearly define what it is. So I think the key question for me is, at this point, while it would probably be ideal, and I think all of us recognize that allocated parking provides much greater flexibility, and I am not sure under the current circumstance we face today with Mr. Christensen that that's a luxury we may have today to do that. And so we were supportive of the idea of creating the committee jointly between the council and the administrative staff to try to define some of these things for the next round of parking needs and consideration, and maybe we do go in and try to change some agreements as they currently exist. So I think the city staff has been supportive of trying to find a reasonable compromise in this issue with Mr. Christensen and the Blue Sky development team. That doesn't reduce our interest in trying to do the right thing with parking as we move forward from here.
Yeah.
So I realize that's a very careful answer and probably doesn't give you what you want, but I think that's been our position as we've been trying to go through this process. Let's find the best, most reasonable agreement we can, and then let's start resolving the longer-term issues with parking in the downtown now.
Mr. Parker, you said allocated. You might not consider the allocated issues that we have today, or did you mean dedicated? Is what I was.
Well, let me just say again, for clarity, for those who might be paying attention, the idea of allocated parking spaces is to say you need 55 spaces in the parking structure. You can use 55 parking spaces in the parking structure, but you couldn't go in and put a sign that says reserved for this user only for a given period of time. That would be dedicated parking. So for example, when we did the 63 East project, the parking agreement was essentially silent in terms of dedicated parking. But when we allocated our parking stalls to them, they went to the owners of the Wells Fargo building and said, hey, for residential tenants, we really need dedicated, protected, reserved parking stalls. And that was what was negotiated. And so when we allocated the parking, the dedication really happened between the parking lot owner and the developer of 63 East. And so those things have developed in various ways over the years as those parking stalls have been assigned or allocated. So again, I think if the city were to go in and build a new parking structure today in the downtown, and we were to use some funding source to do that, and we built a parking structure, we might very well say there won't be any dedicated stalls in this parking structure because we'd like to maximize the utilization of those stalls around the clock. And so they are available on a first come, first served basis, or potentially we do some kind of permit parking, but not particularly dedicate specific stalls, to a given user. I'm not sure we have the luxury to do that today under the circumstances we're in. So again, I think if we were starting over, we might think about it differently, and we might be a lot more specific about how we would structure the use of those parking stalls. At the time, we didn't. Again, not really thinking that this was part of a larger solution, but much more of a way, how do we get this development to occur and start rebuilding the year-round, day-round viability of the core of downtown.
So I would just like to point out real quickly that there is no, other than the spaces, there are no agency or city funds going to the support of this project. So we didn't do any land write-downs. There is no tax increment being made available. There was no land assembly, there are no grants. So in the case of the Liberty Square, Liberty Center, we assembled the property, but we also had some grant money that we had from HUD that went into that parking structure. So in this particular case, making the spaces available at a reduced rate is the only incentive that is being provided that in order to help this project be successful and to enable Mr. Christensen's potential retailers, restaurateurs to succeed.
We'd like to welcome George Stewart. And George, I don't know if you have any questions. We are coming to the end of our discussions, I think.
No questions for now.
Okay. So I agree in an ideal world that we would probably have a different approach, and we have formed a committee to look at the big picture. But considering everything that has gone on, I believe that, well, certainly I will be voting for this. And I appreciate, McKay, your patience and you're willing to compromise on this, and your appreciation of the various things that we're trying to also balance. So unless there's other questions, yes, Gary?
I do have questions about, Dave, we talked about University Plaza?
Tower?
Yes,
sir.
We've got the
Los Hermanos.
Los Hermanos. We have another space that used to next to
La Dolce Vita.
Yeah.
So they are all options. I mean, they all would be interested in having spaces available. The developer, so the former 80 East project is under contract, but they're not going to need all the spaces that the original developer had anticipated, plus that they are going to need some sort of access to the parking structure from their building. And we're not going to be able to provide that. So I don't know how that's going to get resolved. The Los Hermanos project, they would like to increase and densify, add a couple of stories of residential parking. They would presumably come to us to see if we could accommodate the residents. So we would have to have a separate agreement for that. And then on the University Tower, they were requesting tax increment as well as parking spaces, and we did not have the mechanism to give them the tax increment that they needed. So we would have to take a look at what they're proposing and seeing if we could get the school district to agree to, and the county, of course, if they could be cooperative.
Because that's gone by the way.
Yes, excuse me.
Okay.
it's been mentioned a couple times by different parties that in a more perfect world would maybe have a little different agreements on our parking and set them up differently and have different ways to offer to people. But because this project is moved along to where it was, that maybe we can't do that. My concern is this: as we continue the policies that we've done in the past that we're all kind of agreeing aren't totally correct or aren't there, we've decided to form a committee to go over those things. It seems to me that if we go ahead and approve dedicated stalls, that we're just continuing our not so good policy, and also we're encouraging the next developer, whether it be Los Hermanos, whether it be that say, well, you've done it here, so we expect it here. And I'm just thinking we've got to not do this and get our policy in place, and then people will know. It was also mentioned that the reason that we had the parking structure was to encourage the redevelopment of downtown, which is true. But I think the redevelopment does not just include building new buildings and providing parking for them, but also new businesses, new restaurants that go in existing buildings. That redevelopment is all part of the whole process. And so I think favoring one right now to give these dedicated places that may hurt other companies and businesses that are already there, I think puts them at a disadvantage. So I still am not in favor of the dedication of the parking stalls, whether they be 55 or 37. And I think we look at a way to allocate and get more flexibility out of our limited parking that we'll have downtown.
George.
I was hoping they'd come up with something other than designated, because I can't vote for designated places. They've just shown to be very inefficient in the past. I don't know why we'd want to do that. I was hoping, sorry I'm late, I was hoping there'd be something different that we would be presented, but I guess not.
Well, we've reduced the number that we're requesting to be dedicated.
I understand reduced and increased it, but it's still designated, which hasn't proven to be viable in my mind.
So I would have a question for Brian Jones, but he's not here.
Yeah, he stepped out to get a copy of the contract for George, but he'll be back. So I was busy responding to something else, but is there a review clause or review trigger in there?
Yes, we would be adding one.
Well, what does that look like?
I think we would just come back and, on Mr. Christensen's behalf, if there are issues with his restaurants and they're struggling, then he was requesting the ability to come back and renegotiate. And I think we were saying that, we wanted to be able to take a look at the usage and see if there was, to reevaluate that.
Do we have the ability to initiate a review that benefits the city?
That was the intent, to put that in there.
Okay.
Go ahead, Dave.
I would be very interested in that, because I'm concerned for all of our restaurants and all of our retail, and I'm hopeful that with changing kind of the paradigm of how we do parking, that we would be able to facilitate all of our downtown users. And if we can put together a decent system, that we get high utilization, so we find that the patrons of downtown have good options and clear understanding of where they can go for parking at different prices, or for different amounts of time. It would be nice to be able, if we have a well-functioning downtown parking system, to increase the number of stalls that we have for that, particularly if if the restaurants at Blue Sky can benefit from that as well. So having that review option would be very meaningful to me. The one other thing I wanted to mention, I don't know if I won't dive into it too much now, but I think this is something that we need to take a look at. My understanding is at some point at the beginning of the conversation, there was an offer to use some of the parking resources that were at the disposal of the RDA. And, that was a fairly high-level discussion. Later on, at some point, that became, a request for dedicated spaces. But this is, as far as I'm aware, this is the first time that this issue is the first time, or, the last couple of months was the first time that the council had an opportunity to weigh in specifically on the question of dedicated parking for this development. So it's not as though the council signaled early on that this is something that we were willing to do and are changing our minds now. And perhaps we need to do a better job communicating with our own staff of the RDA, and I don't know if other departments and whatnot, but I do think we need to be careful that as things are being negotiated in concept, that it be clear that this is all dependent on the approval of the municipal council, and we need to make sure that we're on the same page as much as possible, so we don't get to the end and feel a lot of pressure or feel like we're have brought people along with something that we're not comfortable doing. So I don't know I don't want to make too big of a deal of that, but I do think that that's something we need to be careful of, and we may want to take a look and make sure that we're not doing that in other circumstances. Not just parking, but just everywhere where the council needs to make the final decision on something. Make sure that communication is there, so we don't find ourselves in this situation again.
Okay, so I have a question, Dave. So in the future, we may have other projects that want an unknown number of spaces, and they may or may not want them designated. And the thought occurred to me that, we're not the only entity that they can approach. We have control of only a portion of what is there. They could actually go to the owner of the building. I mean, if they're going to actually alter and enter the structure, that's rather big. And if they want a certain number of spaces, the owner, you would think, could designate spaces. We're not the only ones, right?
No, sir. So, the agencies purchased, as Mr. Parker had alluded to earlier, the agencies participated in all of the structures in the downtown area in one form and another, but we do not have a uniform method. So, we've provided tax increment in cases, we've helped assemble property in other cases, we have done both, we've done land write-downs, provided grant funding in one case. And so there are, for example, with the Provo Town Square structure, that was, we own the land, and we allow the owners of the Provo Town Square to lease that out. And so they do have a significant number of leases for this benefit of Central Bank. So they do dedicate those spaces. So, but there's not a uniform way. We do not at present have a parking authority. So I think in a perfect world, we probably may have established a parking authority some time ago to kind of have a more consistent. For the Marriott structure, there's a number of units in there that are available to the downtown business employees as well as to the shoppers and people that stop at the restaurants, but most people don't know that, and because our agreement with the Marriott allows them to operate and control access excuse me, many people choose not to use those spaces in there.
So how many total spaces in the Wells Fargo? It's over 500, right?
Yes. And we have 204.
Out of 560 or?
Closer to, yeah, about 560, I guess.
Okay, so, worst case, if all of ours were allocated or designated or given away to somebody, there's still roughly 350 spaces left that could be negotiated or allocated or whatever, or designated by them going to the owner. Because really, we have to get the permission of the owner, and we did contact the owner, and they're willing to acquiesce, but we're not the final arbiter of this. They had to agree to it. So I just wanted to make that clear that even if we run out of spaces, that's not the end of the story. Gary?
Mr. Chair, with this being presented here today for 37 and raising the price, and I would really like to, I'm not ready to vote for this today. I don't feel comfortable voting for it, and I don't feel comfortable not voting for it. I'm voting it down and saying go away. And so I don't want to deal with that. I would like to ask for, I'd like to make a motion that we postpone this for 2 weeks, and I apologize that this is personal for me, that I would like to do a little studying on my own on the ramifications of what will happen. That was my concern all along, is what's this going to do? What are we left with now? And what are the opportunities that we have? And I would like to just take 2 weeks and actually see for myself and get to a greater comfort level. I'm not ready. I appreciate McKay and the effort that he's put forth. I think this is an awesome project. Is it the only project that we can have on that property? Absolutely not. I think a wise man told me that if we put out 55 stalls and said we have 55 stalls, we could probably find several takers for that piece of property. And so I would like to get just a little more comfort in the decision that I would be making at this point, rather than turning it down completely with this new agreement, this new offer that we received just today.
Do we have a second on Gary's motion? Dave Sewell. Okay, procedurally, are we just ready to vote on that then? Do we
have a discussion of the motion? I'm just curious what we're going to, maybe you don't know, but I'm curious what it is that you are not, what information you do not have at this point that would make the difference.
I'm a little bit curious as to what we would have, like I said, with the remaining. He's talked about the remaining, and I just haven't had a chance really to assimilate what we have left. And I would like to have some discussion more around dedication versus allocation, and understanding exactly where he explained where the dedication would be, and I would like to go out and actually drive it and look at it and see it. This is where they will be dedicated, and this is where it will be left. Just a personal assurance. And I know that this is for me, and I appreciate, and I hope, I'm asking for the indulgence, and I appreciate what you're doing.
That's helpful for me. I'm not going to be here in 2 weeks, so I wouldn't be able to vote on it in 2 weeks. So.
Oh, I understand that. Thank you.
George.
Yeah, I'm ready to vote tonight. I'm reading the shall be designated by the landlord and tenant as shown in Exhibit A and marked according as reserved exclusively for tenants' use. Parking outside of designated spaces shall be prohibited. It's just, if the agreement's going to come back with any kind of dedication at this price that we're selling these lots for, 2 weeks is not going to change my mind. I don't know. I agree with George that I don't know what new information we could possibly have that would change my mind, as long as the agreement is, I was hoping that would happen before tonight. I think that has been expressed by a number of us, but no changes have occurred. No major changes in dedication versus otherwise.
So I have a question for Brian now that he's back. Based on the history and the sequence of events and how things have come to where they are today, if we turn this down, because there have been some, I think, representations or assurances made along the way, and if we say no at this point, are there any legal consequences?
One of these times you're going to ask me that question, and the fact that I can't answer in a public meeting is going to reveal what the answer is. In this instance, I would say that there are no, I'm not sure that I am aware of all the facts, so my answer is contingent upon only the facts that I know, but I'm not aware of any agreements, not aware of any express promises. Even if there were express promises, unless those promises are made by someone with authority to make them, they're generally not legally binding. There's a legal principle called promissory estoppel, and the case law in the state of Utah suggests that promissory estoppel is not a valid cause of action against a city government. So I'm not aware of any legal ramifications.
Okay. So we have a motion and a second to postpone. Dave Sewell.
I just wanted to clarify, so I wasn't aware that Mr. Hanley was not going to be here in 2 weeks. My reason for supporting the 2-week delay, which I would now say would need to be 4 weeks, is if it seems like without Mr. Winterden's support that this was not going to pass, and if he had a reasonable prospect that he might want supported after further study, that's why I was supporting his motion.
I understand. So you're, Gary, are you willing to change your motion to 4 weeks instead of 2?
Yes.
Okay, Dave Harding.
Just as a programming note, there is a reasonable chance that we may be canceling the council meeting on the 6th of August. So 4 weeks may be the next council meeting that we actually hold. And then just a thought, I do welcome a little more time to discuss this. I feel like there's been movement on people's opinions that I've heard for the first time today, so I would appreciate some more time to look into this. And quite honestly, I would hope that perhaps in the next, I guess 4 weeks at this point, that maybe we could find more creative solutions or look at some of these opportunities to renegotiate. I really do feel like we're going to change how parking functions downtown, and to lock up these spaces for that long period of time, I'm uncomfortable with. I would love to be able to support this. I support the project overall. I would love to support how we find good parking for the tenants. It's not just in the interest of the restaurant owners. It's not just in the interest of the landowners. In all of our interests that people have good, functioning, convenient, understandable parking that encourages people to come downtown rather than gives them a reason not to come downtown. We need to solve that. We need to solve it for everyone. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to continue this and then come back with something that we can that has more support.
Okay. Any other discussion before we vote? Yes.
Just for point of clarification, because of the schedule, because of the municipal primary on the 13th, the next council meeting after the 6th will actually be the 27th. So just for clarification, you're talking 5 weeks. Which isn't a problem. I'm just telling you that that's the actual date. So we won't be having a meeting in 4 weeks, but we will in 5.
So do you want to just change it to the next council meeting or 5 weeks, or how do you want to modify your motion?
Okay, August 27th meeting. I think that's my safest bet at this point.
And I'll amend my second accordingly.
Okay. Unless there's any discussion, we're ready to vote. Ms. Kay.
One question. Mr. Hardy mentioned he'd like more time to possibly look at other options or working out review processes. It seems like if this is voted down, we're voting just not to do the parking as it is. And I don't know, McKay, what your thoughts or what your feelings will be. If that part is voted down, is there really a strong feeling that this development walks away? Or given the concerns that we have and some of the other options now that have been introduced, won't there be a proposal to maybe include those in a new recommendation from Mr. Christensen rather than us trying to be the ones that need to allow that? I think so. Rather than delay 5 weeks, we vote down, something else comes back to us now, and we move forward rather than we wait for 5 weeks and we vote on this, and then we go through the same process anyway. That's my only concern, that we even delay it further.
Okay, George?
Thank you, Kay. That was my feeling. If we vote this down, we're saying this agreement as it stands doesn't really, we can't support it. And they could come back with a new agreement in 5 weeks. I would rather them know if this is the council's wishes, that this is not acceptable as presented to us tonight, even with some slight adjustments, and let them bring a new agreement 5 weeks from now. But there's no reason to continue this. I agree that if you continue it and then you vote it down, then you have to give more time to come back with a new agreement. But anyway.
Does that give you pause for thought?
Yeah, it does. If we vote it down, where are we then?
Procedurally, that's a good question. Dave?
Why don't I weigh in? Is that okay, Dave?
Sure.
I'm just thinking by analogy, we get stuck in this rut sometimes because we deal with so much land use stuff, right? That we don't want to take final action, because if you take final action on a land use item, then someone has to pay a filing fee to file a new application, and it has to go through planning commission, and it starts a whole new process. Where this is not that kind of thing, it's basically just up to the applicant's desire to try something else, right? But there's nothing that, as has been mentioned, there's nothing that prevents them from coming back to the very next council meeting and say, I've got a different idea I want to try. The danger, I suppose, or the con is they may be so discouraged by the message they may take away is that nothing's going to work, so I'm going to quit trying. But that's up to the applicant and to their determination. There's nothing procedurally that prevents them from just working with city staff and coming back with an entirely new idea.
Mr. Chair, I'd be interested to hear from the applicant again if he has thoughts on what we're discussing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. So a couple different things. So my building permits are into the city right now. We were waiting on comments, I think, from structural. I talked to my architect today. We're literally 2 weeks away from having our building permits issued. So I think I've mentioned this to you before. We've spent about $700,000 on our designs with our architect. Those are into the city. I'm ready to pull permits and go. Having said that, there's a condition that the planning department has put on the approval of our building permits, which is I've got to have this agreement in place. Now, really what it boils down to is like what Wayne said, it really is an issue over allocated versus dedicated, right? Allocated, we feel like we already have the letter that we have from the mayor's office says that the stalls are allocated, you can have them. In my mind, that should be enough to satisfy the planning department and just say, go pull your permits and go. Frankly, if it's allocated, I don't know that I even need an agreement because I just point to the Wells Fargo structure and say, go park there, right? But the flip side of that is it really does nothing for me. To illustrate that point, when we brought in Cabela's to Traverse Mountain, we didn't want to give away 40 acres of land for free, and we didn't want to put in $7 million of infrastructure in order to entice them to come, but we had to. And literally that's what we did. We built a $7 million road and we gave them 40 acres of free land just to have them come. And we did that because we knew that if we got Cabela's, we could get an outlet mall, which we got years later. And then when we got the outlet mall, there was a whole series of concessions that we had to make for, Polo and Nike and other tenants that came along. My point is that I don't always dictate, the developers don't dictate the rules. And I think you're going through this with Target, right? Are you not, Dave? I mean, I'm going through it with Target myself. Target has a deed restriction on a piece of property that we own. We have to pay them $55,000 for it to go away. That's it. That's all they want. They just want $55,000, right? Like, when you have tenants, they just sort of dictate what it is that you have to do, and that's what I'm dealing with on this property. George's point and Dave's point, I think, is wonderful. If we were coming into the city and say, hey, we're proposing to build Blue Sky here, I don't, and bring in, whether it's Pizzeria 712 or a whole slew of other restaurants, I don't think anyone would probably hesitate to say, look, we're not taking any RDA funds. We're not doing some type of joint venture where the RDA is donating land. We're getting no help from the city on anything other than just parking to promote some new restaurant that we're bringing into town along with this development. And the last thing that I'll say, the council has been wonderful. Like I say that regardless of the outcome, you spend time with me. I appreciate it. I went through this once before with 6 of you, right, on the parking issue. I came in about 3 years ago when we were going over parking and when we were going over the average and minimum unit sizes of the units. That took me a year and a half to get that parking changed, a year and a half. Now, the outcome of that is that PEG built their development. There's no parking problems with PEG's development on University. They're going to be building another one that's on Freedom Boulevard. I don't foresee the city, thinking that there are any parking problems there either. And yet it took me a year and a half to get that approved. In the interim, my costs went from $16 million to $24 million in that year and a half time. And for what? For the amount of time that it took us to be able to make an amendment for parking and for those unit sizes. And I'm eternally grateful that we got them. Genuinely I am. But it cost us $8 million. And I find myself at the end of, we began this in 2014, I find myself now in 2019 on the eve, at the 11th hour of pulling my building permits. And I've got this agreement that I've been working on now for 2-3 years. And no issue over allocated or dedicated was ever brought up during that time period. There were no arguments, there were no red lines sent back to me saying, no dedicated, no dedicated, no dedicated. Okay? And so I understand the concern. I've tried literally, I've met with the council members, I've tried to pull from each one of you, including Cliff, what your concerns are, whether it's the cost of the stalls, whether it's the time limits, overnight or not overnight, or the amount of stalls that it is that we're asking for. I really have tried to come back in with a compromise. I hope that you understand that. The downside of pushing it out 5 weeks, if it means that that's what you need, Gary, to get comfortable, I'll do it. If that's the amount of time that you need to get comfortable, I'll do it. Just understand that it's pushing my building permits back. And it's continuing to push my project back. And in the meantime, interest rates change. Things just change, So, but if that's what you need to get comfortable, I'll spend any amount of time that you or any of the other council members need to get there. I just hope that you understand that's what, from a development side, from a developer side, those are the things that we're weighing out on our end. So.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. And so, Gary, do you have any thoughts at this point, or do we vote on your motion?
I'm really torn on this. I see advantages to going both directions here and now. I think, at this point, I think I'm going to withdraw my motion, and I don't care if he comes back in 5 weeks with the exact same motion. This is something that I think that we need to look at. So I'm going to withdraw my motion at this point.
Okay. Well, that leaves us, I guess, unless there's more discussion, with a vote on the implied motion that's before us.
Mr. Chair, if I could just make one comment that Mr. Walter made several representations at the beginning of the discussion about changes that have been negotiated to the exhibit that's actually in your materials. As I understand it, no one, not even the developer, is still proposing that you approve the exhibit that is actually in your materials. That being the case, it would not be appropriate to vote on the implied motion as it currently stands. Hannah, if you could put up the language that I sent you. I sent Hannah some language that my suggestion would be, if you want to proceed tonight on approving a deal that matches what Mr. Walter described to you, that you first make a motion to amend your resolution to add this language so that the exhibit itself can be amended afterwards.
I so move.
Moved by George Hanley and seconded by Dave Sewell. Ready? Okay.
Just a question, are we clear then on what terms have been negotiated, how we've changed it?
That's probably a question for Mr. Walter. If he's clear on exactly, well, and I guess it's a question for you too. It's a meeting of the minds about whether Mr. Walter understands exactly what needs to happen to the exhibit leaving this meeting, and that the council is on the same page as far as what they're approving. So I don't know if we need it to be described again, or I mean, you know, obviously the other option is to not act tonight and to come back with an exhibit that is a hard copy that actually has the new terms in it. That's probably not something that can be accomplished tonight.
I would hope that before we vote on something that we would be able to articulate them in a fairly succinct list of this is what those negotiated deal points are.
As I understand it, there's three, right? It's 37 spots, 12 of which are going to be dedicated 24/7, 25 of which are going to be dedicated between 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. And the remaining 20 of the 57 would be allocated. And that there would be, the only thing that's a little unclear is that there would be a point at which we would review it from the interests of both perspectives, from the interests of the city and from the interest
So
of
it would be the change in the dedication and the allocation, the number of spaces, the increase in the cost of the lease payments.
Sorry, I forgot that one, yeah.
And the review clause that we would put in there. So one for Mr. Christensen and one for us. Review clauses, I guess I should say.
And related to the lease of the spots is the length of the terms, is that not correct? How long that's going to be, how long those terms are?
Right, so, right. So in the agreement as it stands now, it's kind of a sliding scale, and this would be now just three different tiers. That's my understanding of the revisions that would need to happen to the agreement.
That seems pretty clear to me. I'm comfortable voting on it.
Any other questions of Dave Walter? I think we need to actually vote on changing this. Okay.
We've already moved for that to happen, right?
Yes.
Right, yes, you have a motion on the table to make that amendment, so you'd vote first on the amendment. If it passes, then you would vote on the implied motion to approve the amended version of the amended version of the resolution.
Right. All in favor of amending the resolution with the following shown language? All opposed? George Stewart opposed. Everyone else in favor? Is that? Yes. Okay, so now we're ready to vote on the new document. All in favor? All opposed? So we have George Hanley, Dave Knack, and Dave Sewell in favor, and George Stewart, Gary Winterton, Kay Van Buren, and Dave Harding opposed. Okay, thank you. We will now move on to the next item, which is item 5. A resolution authorizing the Chief Executive Officer to enter into an owner participation agreement with Millrace Development, LLC, to transfer agency-owned property for a project located between 5th South and 6th South and 100 West and University Avenue, as presented by David Walter, our Director of Redevelopment.
Chair Connect and agency members, good evening. So the item tonight is the next step in the development of the Millrace project, which would allow the agency to put in its quarter block that it owns for the development that would occur, which would include an office complex, a condominium tower, and multifamily residential. So there would be the redevelopment of the entire block. The agreement asks we would include some tax increment that would be generated on the site. The applicant, Mr. Justin Earl, has already been before the council for a development agreement and for a pro-zone amendment to allow for this development to occur, and this would be the piece that the agency would then participate in order to make that happen. The development anticipates having some parking provided for the project, and excuse me, and also for the completion of a pedestrian bridge that would cross not only the railroad tracks but 600 South. Staff is available for any questions.
Any questions of David?
Mr. Chairman, if I could. David, so earlier today in the work meeting, there was discussion around the concern about trying to provide some additional incentive for owner occupancy in the condominium project. The owner participation agreement includes some language relative to tax increment, and one of the suggestions by members of the board in work meeting was that we condition some elements of tax increment based on the success of the developer with owner occupancy. The agreement currently suggests that they'll essentially give their best effort to owner occupancy, but I just wanted to raise the question before we go much further with the owner participation agreement to ensure that if we come up with a tax increment agreement that conditions some of the tax increment on some success with owner occupancy, that's still in play. And I don't know if you've had conversations with Mr. Earl since then.
I had a chance to call Mr. Earl and chat with him. He is available. He is anticipating doing an homeowners association for the condominium project, and I don't know if that would. Yeah. So, he's kind of I'll just turn the time over to Mr. Earl then and let him.
Thank you. So when I was heading here, driving down the road, a big biker waves me down and says, "Roll down your window," and he says, "You got a flat tire." So those 8 minutes cost me about an hour. Serves me right. So my apologies for tardiness, and I thank you for your willingness to shift the agenda around. So as far as providing language. So we will have a homeowners association, probably a property owners association, because the whole property will be governed, including the multifamily, the office, and the condo piece, all under one association rather than a fractured multiple associations. We think it'd be better to be coordinated. So it'll be all under one property owners association. And as Brian will, I'm sure, concur, there's a lot of examples where your condominium declarations have requirements for percentages of ownership versus rentership. So we're comfortable with that concept. I guess I would request that we have a reasonable ratio of what that is, not because we intend to lease them, but because we don't want to be found in default for circumstances that may or may not be in our control. And I brought a document with a few paragraphs I'd like to read that illustrate a few examples where rentership is helpful in a project like this. And I just like to read this for your consideration. This is from a condominium law article that addresses a lot of these topics. The Massachusetts Supreme Court said, those who live in condominiums must be willing to give up a certain degree of personal choice in order to promote the welfare of the majority of the owners, the court observed. The court also agreed that preserving the community's ownership character and protecting property values are appropriate and justifiable goals. So that they're saying that it is an appropriate thing to place restrictions on rentership versus ownership. So they're affirming that that's a right that developers and associations have to put into a property. But they also caution against real-world scenarios that you don't want to put that threshold too high. Some examples include these problems are not theoretical. They are all too real byproducts of economic downturn that depresses real estate from time to time and leaves condominium owners financially underwater, struggling with units worth less than they paid for them and with mortgages exceeding the current value of the homes. A recent example includes one condominium owner who lost his job, is moving in with parents. Cannot sell his unit for enough to pay off the mortgage, but the rent he could command would cover the mortgage payments and common area fees. He cannot rent the unit, however, because the community has reached the 10% rental cap. As a result, this owner will lose the unit to a foreclosure he might otherwise have avoided. Another more fortunate owner of the unit in the building has found a job in another city, but the unit he purchased for $750,000 is only worth $650,000 today. He'd like to rent the unit until the market recovers, avoiding a $100,000 loss. But again, the community has reached its rental limit, precluding that option for him. These outcomes are not desirable, to say the least, for the two owners involved, but foreclosures and below-market sales will impair the value of other units in the community. So it's too bad for those two people, but it's actually too bad for the entire community because, as I'm sure you're all aware, one foreclosure in the neighborhood or next door or down the street actually adversely affects the property values of all the homes in the area. So where it's too bad that the one guy moved out of town and he can't rent the unit, now he's going to lose the property to foreclosure, that actually negatively impacts all of the units because an arbitrary, rental cap was a little bit too low. Another scenario here, which I found interesting, you've got to make sure it doesn't adversely impact estate planning. Older owners of condominiums, which a project such as this will probably have a higher percentage of older ownership, they do estate planning, and creative forms of estate planning include transferring property title from the senior folks that live there to perhaps a younger child or children. Same person's lived there for 10, 15 years. Title's changed, but now technically the person living in the unit is a renter. And these are some examples of where we don't want technicalities or unfortunate circumstances to cause problems, real-world problems, for the people occupying the units. There's some strategies that I'd like to just list a few that can help address some of these issues. The very first one is limiting the number or percentage of units that can be rented. That's like the knee-jerk, most obvious option. Another one is to establish a minimum lease term, meaning you can only lease for 12 months or longer. That avoids the hotel, Airbnb type scenario. You can restrict the number of units a single individual owns. That's a really effective strategy in these communities where a lot of them are rentals. Oftentimes, one investor or investor group will come in and purchase multiple units. We would like people to be able to purchase at least 2, not because we want them to rent, but I've actually already had phone conversations with a couple in Alpine that owns a business downtown Provo, wants to move into one of the upper floors of the condo, but they want a larger unit than what we have available, so they want to purchase 2 adjacent to each other and connect the 2, which is permitted in our declaration, and have a larger unit that way. So we don't want to allow 3 and 4 units. I don't see any scenario where that's really justifiable or necessary, but I could see scenarios where folks want 2 units to combine them and make them larger. And then there's other stipulations that could be put on, such as they have to be lived in for a certain number of years. So those are a few things just to point out. This article anyways, their recommendation, because it is an appropriate stipulation to put into a community like this, is to follow federally approved guidelines already. FHA, for instance, already has limits of what percentage of units can be owner-occupied versus renter-occupied. And that's based on decades and decades of data on millions of units across the country. And in fact, they track the data well enough that they changed the ratio in 2016. It was a 50-50 stipulation, where 50% of the units had to be owner-occupied and no more than 50% could be renter-occupied. And the data over, again, decades and millions of case studies has shown that that was higher than necessary to protect the integrity of the projects. And they recently reduced that limit to 35% owner-occupied versus 65% renter-occupied. I'm not proposing that, but I think there is FHA has a lot better resources than I have and has a lot more data at their fingertips to suggest appropriate ratios and limits. Yeah.
So we just had a project get approved on 1320 South State Street. It's going to be condos.
Yeah.
And they're selling for about $180,000, which is a really great opportunity. They apparently were still under the impression it was 50%, and so their HOA was going to stipulate that owner occupancy not fall below 60%. So did you have a number in mind that you thought was a reasonable target?
Well, in my mind, it's just let's follow whatever the FHA guidelines are. If the FHA is 35%, that's what I would have recommended. If it's 50%, that's what I would recommend. Again, they've got the data, millions of units of case study. This does say that on higher end type units, we're not going to be selling these for $180,000. The instances of rentership is just by nature going to be much smaller than it would be otherwise. For instance, $180,000, that's an attractive first investment for somebody. So I don't know that we had a specific number other than we want to maintain flexibility. We don't want to find ourselves in a situation where there's unfortunate circumstances. And I would like to mention one other thing that I think is quite important just to keep in mind, and that is in the development agreement. If I may read just one sentence in there that is in the development agreement. So this is in section 4, I believe. It's section 3. This is section 3. and it's under letter E, condominiums, and then subletter III. So this is the development agreement that we voted on a couple months ago, and I'll read the whole paragraph. Condominiums. Developer has expressed its intention to sell condominiums as part of the project. Prior to the city issuing a certificate of occupancy on the final phase of the project, developer shall demonstrate their commitment to selling condominiums through I, the actual sale of condominiums, II, documented marketing efforts to sell such condominiums, or III, or III, providing written evidence of developer's good faith attempt to obtain reasonable debt financing of such condominiums and corresponding written evidence the developer has been unable to obtain debt financing for such condominiums on commercially reasonable or viable terms. That language wasn't, it's here up on the screen. That was intentionally negotiated and put in. Condo development loans, construction loans, are much harder to get than full rent construction loans. Condo high-rise loans are much harder to get than regular condo construction loans. So the intention for that sub 3 was, if we just keep hitting roadblock after roadblock after roadblock with getting construction financing for the tower element, we would have an easier opportunity to secure construction financing if it were marketed as for lease for a period of time for the construction period, and then it was a condo conversion, which is something that happens often, and then it's converted into a for sale product. So I guess this brings up 2 points. The first point is an acceptable ratio that the council's comfortable with, the board, is comfortable with, and that we're comfortable with. And then the second issue is, if we have to go the route of adjusting the financing strategy because of roadblocks and have to go for lease for a period, we would probably want to put in some kind of a time clause whereupon, it's only allowed to be for lease for a period of time, wherein it would have to be converted to for sale. Does that make sense? So.
Well, I appreciate the fact you've done your homework, and the idea of limiting the number of buyers is critical. Some of those caveats are very helpful in making sure you get the right outcome. So Wayne mentioned that we were looking at the TIF and maybe addressing ownership in that. And
correct.
I knew it was difficult. I didn't realize high rises were even more difficult.
It's a different animal.
Yeah, but my idea was the most important outcome for this block and this part of downtown is to have some stability, some owner occupancy, and
that's why we put the condo tower in the first place, specifically at the request of the stake president of the area.
Yeah, and so I put forward the idea that if we could help incentivize the outcome, and I'm not sure exactly how that incentive would work or what it would look like, how much money or whatever, but basically showing a willingness on our part to help you towards that outcome.
Oh, I would appreciate it. I'd love to understand what that would look like, but yeah, that would be welcomed on our end.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So, I don't know, 35% to 50%, that's FHA guidelines 2016, 2019. So that's...
And maybe we could solidify, what are the current guidelines, and if you fall below a certain magic number, whichever it is, so you probably want to have the number that your goal a little bit above that, so it's not just on the razor's edge.
Yes, and then some guidance that this attorney provides is perhaps having hardship clauses that the board could exceed it for very special hardship circumstances. That has to be proved, show financials and those types of things that support the hardship. But the board would have the ability to vote for some exceptions. So, thank you.
Okay, I don't know if anyone has any questions at this point. We kind of got off topic a little bit. That was a great presentation, but that is going to be, I guess, brought up at a later time. So I believe we're probably ready to vote on the implied motion if there aren't any other. Well, yes. Okay. We still have some Yes, we still have some public here. So is there anyone in the public who would like to comment on this before we bring it back to the council? Yes. Thanks.
I just want to comment on this Beth Alligood, Provo resident. I appreciate the research that he's done into this in dealing with people and asking them questions about one of the issues of Provo. They say it's turning into I'll go closer. It's turning into kind of a renter's playground for investors. They come in and they buy up a whole bunch of rent units and then rent them out. And so I appreciate the research that he's done on this and how to combat that so that we do have that owner occupancy, so we do have that ability to make this not an investor's playground, but something that can be really positive for the people in Provo to build a community within this tower. And so I really appreciate that. It kind of goes towards an issue that we're having. I really like the idea of limiting how many units a person can buy. I think that would help a lot in that outside investors trying to do that. I personally, honestly, would like to see like a 50% occupancy on that tower. I understand the reasonings why hardships come along to everybody in their lives. Sorry, I'm choking on my spit. Yay. Hardships come along to everybody in life. So providing provisions to allow those hardships to kind of do that. And so I really think that it's good that he's trying to develop in the community and do responses to the community and help the community grow in a positive way. So thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Well, seeing no other members of the public, we'll bring this back to the council and see if there's any discussion or if we're ready for a vote. Looks like we're ready. All in favor of the implied motion? That's unanimous with Dave Harding absent, excused. Okay, and if there's no objection, we will now adjourn this meeting of the Redevelopment Agency of Provo by unanimous consent. And Cliff?
Going back to the other meeting. Before you go to the other meeting, last council meeting, the council passed a resolution or adopted a resolution endorsing the Good Governance Advisory Board's recommendations. Mayor, did you want to speak to this at all?
Actually, you're the one that brought it to my attention, so I got online and was trying to hear from the Good Governance Advisory Board people, and nobody seems to be responding. So
All right.
Why don't you go ahead and talk about
Let
what you found?
Let me tell you what's that about. Karen sent me a notice. Apparently I'll pull it up here for reference, but apparently the Board of Commissioners of Utah County will hold an emergency public meeting on Thursday, July 25th at 7:45 a.m. This is the agenda. Approve the order calling an emergency meeting. 2, time-sensitive update on form of government discussion. 3, adopt a resolution to submit to the voters whether to adopt the optional plan created by the Utah County Commission in accordance with the recommendations of the Good Governance Advisory Board. So we haven't been able to confirm any details or what's happened and what is actually happening in that meeting, but this may be a good indication that the commission is may be able to go ahead with the original recommendations to put the question on the ballot. If you haven't been following it, other cities have stepped up. 17 elected officials from the state legislature have did an editorial in the Daily Herald. There's been all sorts of stories talking about this issue, and so I'm hoping that Thursday morning what you'll find out is that our resolution did have some kind of impact.
And it's online. You can watch it online live.
I'll be on a plane.
Oh, sorry. But anyone else that would like to have
Sad, huh?
something to do, you can get it online.
What's that?
I said, or go down to the meeting and make public comment.
Right. Oh, yeah, that would be the thing. Encourage you to go down and make public comment if you have time. 7:45 on Thursday morning.